Victoria Sterling had never believed in love. She believed in leverage, in clauses, in counteroffers, in the cold geometry of a well-drafted agreement. So when the board came for her, demanding she present the image of a stable, married woman or risk losing the company her father had bled to build, she did what she always did. She found a solution. She hired one. His name was Daniel Hayes. He was 35, broke, and raising a 6-year-old daughter alone. And that was supposed to be the end of the story. She had selected him with the same detachment she brought to any acquisition: clean background check, no complications. A fee that was generous enough to ensure compliance. A transaction. That was the word she kept returning to whenever doubt crept in. A transaction. But transactions don't kneel on cold kitchen tile to tie a child's shoes with quiet, unhurried hands. Transactions don't lean close and whisper something that makes a little girl laugh in the stillness of a long evening. And transactions don't make a woman who has spent her entire adult life building walls stand completely still in a hallway, suddenly unsure which side of the glass she belongs on. Victoria Sterling had run Sterling Group since the age of 28, stepping into a corner office that smelled of her father's old ambition and never once looking back. She had grown the company's valuation by nearly 40% in 4 years. She had survived 2 hostile acquisition attempts, a public scandal involving a former CFO, and the kind of sustained media scrutiny that would have broken someone with softer instincts. She had not survived any of it by being warm. She had survived it by being precise. The board's ultimatum had arrived without warning, buried in a quarterly governance review as though it were a footnote. A married CEO projected greater long-term stability, particularly given the company's imminent bid for a federal infrastructure contract worth several $100 million. The language was polished and professional. The implication was not. Victoria had read the memo 3 times, set it face down on her desk, and stared at the city below her for a long moment before making her decision. If they wanted a husband, she would produce one, on her terms. With an exit clause, Daniel Hayes, at that same hour, was stacking boxes in the back of a delivery van at 11:30 at night, trying to finish his route before Lily's school called again about her being dropped off late. His daughter was 6 years old and radiated a particular brand of cheerful stubbornness that made his chest hurt with love every single time. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's habit of going very quiet before saying something unexpectedly profound. She called him Dad like it was the most natural word in any language, which it was, and she had never once doubted that he would show up. He had never once given her reason to. He had been doing this particular job deliveries, part-time dispatch, the occasional contract for a moving company for going on 3 years. It paid the rent on a small 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that was not fashionable but was clean, and it gave him enough flexibility to pick Lily up from school most days and make her dinner and sit beside her while she did her homework at the kitchen table. It was a small life, measured in routines and grocery lists and the sound of a child's breathing in the room next door. He would not have traded it for anything he could think of. The night Victoria Sterling's car broke down on the eastern edge of a commercial district at 10:30 on a Wednesday, she did not call her assistant. Her phone had lost signal in the underpass. She had been driving herself for the first time in months, a deliberate choice after a suffocating week of meetings, and now she stood on a rain-slicked street with her heels on the wet pavement and a car that had simply stopped. Daniel saw her from the cab of his van as he turned the corner on his last run of the night. He pulled over without thinking. He did not recognize her. He simply saw a woman standing alone beside a stopped car in the dark, and that was enough. He looked at the engine for less than 4 minutes before identifying the problem. A failed relay switch, common in older luxury models, something he had seen before in a previous life he rarely mentioned. He had a spare in his toolkit by pure coincidence. He fixed it. When Victoria reached into her bag for her wallet, he shook his head once and stepped back toward his van. She asked him his name. He told her. Then he paused before getting in and leaned back to check the car seat in the rear of his vehicle, where Lily was asleep with her chin tucked against her shoulder and a stuffed rabbit pressed to her chest. He adjusted the blanket over her daughter so gently that Victoria did not speak. She stood there and watched a man handle the most ordinary task in the world with such absolute tenderness that she felt, for reasons she could not explain, as though she were witnessing something private. She took his plate number as he drove away. Her assistant had his full name and a preliminary background summary on her desk by 9 the following morning. She read it twice. Then she made a call. They met in a coffee shop near his apartment building at his request. He arrived on time and ordered nothing. He listened to her proposal without interrupting, his hands folded on the table with the patience of a man who had learned not to rush toward conclusions. When she finished explaining the terms 6 months, public appearances at a fixed schedule of events, a shared residence with separate living arrangements, full confidentiality, and a payment of $250,000 dispersed in monthly installments, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said no. Victoria had not anticipated that. She had prepared for negotiation, for questions about the money, for requests to revise certain terms. She had not prepared for a flat refusal delivered without anger or theater. She asked him why. He said he had a daughter, and he did not want her growing up inside a lie. Victoria told him the arrangement would not affect Lily at all. He said, with the kind of calm that communicated more than volume ever could, that children always know. She started to respond. He stood up, thanked her for the coffee she hadn't actually bought him, and left. She found out 3 days later that Lily had been enrolled in a school waiting list for a specialized learning program designed for children with mild auditory processing difficulties, a program that cost more per semester than Daniel made in a full year. His current savings would not cover the first enrollment deposit. She also discovered, from a source she would not examine too closely, that he had been quietly researching whether he could take a second night job without affecting Lily's morning routine. Victoria called him again. She told him she knew about the school. She said she was not trying to use it against him. She was offering him a way to give his daughter something he could not give her alone. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. He said he needed a week to think. She gave him 4 days. On the 3rd evening, he called back and said yes. Daniel's first night in the Sterling Group penthouse apartment, a corporate residence the size of his entire building's ground floor, he stood in the entrance hall for a moment and said nothing. Lily, who had been told only that they were going to stay somewhere new for a while because of Dad's new job, walked directly to the window and pressed her nose to the glass and looked at the city spread below like a second sky. She said it looked like all the stars had fallen down. Daniel looked at his daughter and then at the room around him, and appeared to reach some quiet internal decision about how he intended to carry himself in this space. Victoria had prepared a briefing, the social calendar, the public posture requirements, a list of names and organizational affiliations he would need to recognize at events. She went through it with the efficiency of someone running a board orientation. Daniel listened, asked 3 clarifying questions, and thanked her. Over the following days, she watched him absorb the information without apparent strain. What she had not expected was that he would also remain, through all of it, entirely himself. He cooked dinner every evening. Not the elaborate, catered meals her household staff could produce on request, but actual food pasta with a sauce he built from scratch, soup that simmered for 2 hours, roasted chicken with the kind of herb crust that meant someone had been paying attention while they cooked. He set the table properly. He asked Lily about her day the way someone asks who actually wants to know the answer. He did not appear to notice that he was doing any of this in a room that cost more per month than some people earned in a year. Victoria found herself eating at the table with them 3 nights in a row before she thought to question why. She told herself it was efficient. She told herself a great many things that month that were adjacent to the truth, but not quite touching it. The apartment developed a rhythm she had not lived inside since childhood, a time she did not often revisit, because the memories there were spare and without warmth. Her own parents had been accomplished and distant in equal measure, people who furnished a life correctly without ever quite inhabiting it. There had been no one to cook, no one to kneel at her level and tie her shoes. She had learned to do that herself at 5, because there was simply no one there to show her. What surprised Victoria most, in those first weeks, was how much Lily seemed to understand without being told anything. Children that age were supposed to need explanations, to require the world managed down to their level. Lily appeared to operate on a different frequency entirely. She absorbed the emotional temperature of a room the way a well-tuned instrument absorbs sound and holds it. She had never once asked whether Victoria and her father were really married, but she had, on a Tuesday morning, placed her hand over Victoria's for a moment while they were both looking at something outside the window and left it there for a slow count of 3. Victoria had not moved. She had sat very still and breathed carefully and tried to understand what was happening to her. She was thinking about this without fully realizing she was thinking about it one evening when she came home earlier than expected and found Daniel and Lily on the living room floor with a deck of playing cards spread between them. Lily was explaining the rules of a game she had clearly invented herself, a game that had no discernible logic but which Daniel was playing with complete seriousness, frowning at his cards and occasionally asking strategic questions that made Lily dissolve into laughter. He did not hear the door. Victoria stood in the entry for a moment and watched him be her father. And the feeling that moved through her chest was one she did not have a professional category for. Later that same week, at 2 a.m, she found him in the hallway outside Lily's room. He had been there for some time. The door was cracked open. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, his head tipped back, eyes open. She asked what was wrong. He said Lily had run a fever around midnight. It had come down with medication. She was sleeping fine now, but he wanted to be close, just in case. He said this the way people state a fact that requires no defense. Then he looked up at her from the floor, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and Victoria was aware of a shift in herself that she was not yet prepared to name. The Sterling Group's autumn dinner for major institutional partners was held at a hotel ballroom in the top floor of a building downtown. It was exactly the kind of event at which Daniel was expected to perform, polished, present, the image of a composed and suitable companion. He wore a dark suit well. He shook hands and remembered names, and said the correct things with the unhurried ease of someone who did not need status to feel grounded. Victoria noticed several board members recalibrate their initial assessments over the course of the first hour. Marcus Webb noticed too. Marcus was the former private equity executive Victoria had dated briefly 2 years ago, a man who measured everyone by the precision of their tailoring and the value of their connections, and who had never entirely forgiven Victoria for ending things without what he considered sufficient distress. He appeared at Daniel's elbow during the cocktail hour with a group of 3 and began with the particular warmth that announces an ambush. The questions started lightly enough: which firm, which sector, which school. When Daniel answered each one honestly, Marcus's group exchanged a look that required no words. One of them asked, with the specific cruelty of people who mistake money for intelligence, whether Daniel found the evening intimidating. Marcus laughed. It was a short sound, calibrated for an audience. Daniel looked at the man who had laughed and said nothing for a moment. Not because he was wounded, but because he was deciding whether the man deserved a response at all. Victoria had heard it from across the room. She had crossed half the distance toward them when Lily, who had been brought along at the event's earlier family hour and was supposed to be in the hotel suite upstairs with the sitter, appeared in the doorway with her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm and her hair slightly undone. She scanned the room with the focused efficiency of a 6-year-old on a mission, located her father, and moved through the crowd without hesitation. "Dad." She reached his side and slipped her hand into his as though the surrounding conversation were not happening at all. He looked down at her, and his face did something it had not done all evening. It simply opened. Every careful composure, every polite neutrality fell away, and what remained was unmistakable. Marcus Webb's group went quiet. Several people nearby turned to look. There was nothing to recover from, no advantage to press. The moment belonged entirely to Daniel and his daughter, and everyone in that small orbit understood this, even if they couldn't have said exactly why. Victoria was the one who finally spoke. She stepped forward and addressed Marcus with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. She said that if he found himself short of conversation, she was happy to discuss the quarterly performance review that had been delivered to the board last week, which reflected, in some detail, the cost of certain legacy relationships that had long since ceased to generate value. Marcus smiled the way people smile when they've been told to leave. He left. In the car on the way home, Lily fell asleep between them with her head against Daniel's arm. Victoria looked at the city, moving past the window, and said nothing for a long time. Then she said thank you. Daniel said she didn't need to. She said she knew. There was a silence after that, which was not uncomfortable, but which she didn't know how to leave. The problem with performing a marriage for long enough is that the performance begins to cost something real. Victoria understood this intellectually before she understood it in any other way. She had read the contractual terms carefully enough to know exactly when the 6 months would end and what the exit looked like. What the terms had not covered was the specific morning in the 4th month when Lily crawled into her bed at 7 and asked, without apparent guile, whether Victoria was ever lonely. She had not answered. She had gotten up and made coffee. She had stood at the kitchen counter for 10 minutes and not been able to explain to herself why the question had landed the way it did. Daniel saw it. He was very good at seeing things without announcing that he had seen them. He had said nothing, only set a second cup of coffee beside hers on the counter and gone to help Lily find her other shoe. But a week after that morning, during a conversation that began practically a scheduling conflict over an event appearance in the 5th month, Victoria said something she had not planned to say. She said she thought the arrangement was working because of him, because of his consistency, his steadiness. She did not know how to not be managing something, she said, and he never seemed to need her to manage him, and she didn't know what to do with that. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said that was probably the most honest thing she had said to him since they met. She felt the ground shift beneath the word honest. She pulled back. The next morning she was precise and formal and entirely professional. She rescheduled 2 shared evenings, cited work commitments, retreated to the version of herself that had always been safest. Daniel watched this happen without reacting. He had been watching her push people back for months. He understood the pattern. But when she canceled dinner on a Wednesday and Lily cried quietly in her room because she had made a drawing to show Victoria after dessert, he sat beside his daughter for a long time, and what he felt was not anger at Victoria. It was something closer to grief, the particular grief of watching someone choose a smaller life than they're capable of, and being unable to do anything about it. He told Victoria, the following evening, that he thought it was best to end the contract at the 5-month mark. He said the public appearances had accomplished what she needed. He said he thought the board would be satisfied. He said it calmly and without cruelty, and he said it in the kitchen while Lily was in the other room, and Victoria stood very still and did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Of course. Whatever works best for your schedule." He watched her say it and did not tell her that she was lying. The day he and Lily left, Victoria was not at the apartment. She was in a board meeting she had rescheduled twice and could not move again. She had told herself this was fine, that it was rational, that departures managed at a distance were simpler. Lily left a drawing on the kitchen counter with Victoria's name written across the top in the large, careful letters of a child who has only recently learned to spell it. Victoria found it that evening. She stood at the counter and looked at it for a long time. It was a picture of 3 people. They were standing in front of what appeared to be a window full of stars. She did not throw it away. She also stood in the kitchen for a long time before she could bring herself to move. There was something about the drawing, the rough, confident lines of a 6-year-old who had drawn what she saw rather than what she'd been told to see, that landed differently than anything Victoria had experienced in a boardroom, or a negotiation, or a carefully structured contract. The people in the drawing had no distinguishing features except proximity. They were simply together, in front of the stars. And that was apparently the whole of the story as Lily understood it. She also, in the 10 days that followed, could not sleep past 5 in the morning. She ate standing at the counter. She worked 16-hour days and felt none of the satisfaction that had always previously accompanied them. She had her assistant pull Daniel's file again, not for any professional reason she could name, and read through it for the 3rd time. It was on that 3rd reading that she found it. A detail that had been in the file since the beginning, flagged but not followed up. Prior employment history. 7 years at an engineering firm in another state. Senior structural design role. A record of performance reviews that used words like exceptional and unusually rigorous. A resignation letter on file dated 4 days after a death certificate, his wife's. No forwarding professional address. No re-entry into the field. She sat with that for a long time. She had assumed, without examining the assumption, that his life had simply not produced more. That he was a delivery driver, because that was the ceiling he had reached. She had furnished the entire emotional architecture of their arrangement around that premise, and it was wrong. He had walked away from a career that had taken years to build on the same day he became a father without a partner. And he had never mentioned it. Not once, not even when she had structured an entire contract around the implicit premise of his financial need. He hadn't told her because he wasn't asking for her to see it that way. He wasn't asking to be admired for it. He had simply made a choice about what his life would be organized around, and he had organized it around Lily, and that was the whole story. Victoria sat at her desk and thought about every moment in the last 5 months that she had misread. The quiet, the patience, the way he had never once seemed diminished by the distance between their circumstances, because the measuring stick he was using had nothing to do with money. She thought about Lily's drawing on her kitchen counter. 3 people in front of a window full of stars. She thought, too, about something Daniel had said in their first real conversation, not the one where she had made her proposal, but the one weeks later, during a long evening when Lily had gone to sleep early and they had sat in the kitchen with the remains of dinner between them and talked, cautiously at first and then less so, about things that had nothing to do with the contract. He had said that the hardest part of grief was not the absence itself but the moments when you forgot, briefly, and then remembered again. She had understood this intellectually then. She understood it differently now. She called her assistant and said she would be unavailable for the rest of the afternoon. Daniel was in the parking lot of Lily's new school, leaning against his van with a coffee he hadn't started yet, when she found him. He looked at her the way people look when they are genuinely surprised but are trying not to show it. She had not called ahead. She had driven herself. She told him she had read the file. All of it. He said he knew she had been thorough the first time. She said she hadn't read it carefully enough, and she wanted him to know that she understood the difference now. He waited. She said she was not there with an offer. She was not there with a contract or a proposal or a set of terms. She told him she had spent every professional relationship of her adult life inside a structure that protected her from having to be uncertain, and that she was certain of very little at the moment, but she was certain of this. The 2 months since he had left her apartment were the loneliest she could remember since she was a child learning to tie her own shoes. She stopped herself there. She had not meant to say that last part. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. He did not say anything immediately, which was characteristic of him, and which she had learned slowly, imperfectly to receive as attention rather than distance. He said he appreciated her coming. He said he needed time. He said Lily had spent 3 days asking when Victoria was going to visit, and that he had not known how to answer, and that was part of why this was not simple. She said she understood. She said she would wait. Then she asked, because she needed to ask it, whether he thought there was anything worth waiting for. He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his expression shifted barely, the way light changes in a room when a cloud moves. He said he didn't know yet, but he said she could come to dinner on Saturday if she wanted to bring her own answer to that question. She said yes before she had finished processing that it was an invitation. Lily opened the door on Saturday and looked up at Victoria with the particular directness that 6-year-olds deploy without any sense of its power. She said she had been waiting. Then she took Victoria's hand and pulled her inside with the presumption of someone who had already decided the outcome and saw no reason to delay it further. Daniel was in the kitchen. He had made the same pasta he had made the first week in the penthouse apartment, with the sauce that took 90 minutes and left the whole place smelling like something lived in and cared for. He looked over his shoulder when they came in and did not say anything for a moment. He didn't need to. They ate at a table that was very much smaller than the one in the Sterling Group penthouse, in an apartment that had a scuff on the wall near the door and a child's artwork taped across half the refrigerator. Lily talked through most of the meal about school, about a story she was writing, about a theory she had developed regarding the behavior of birds. Daniel and Victoria listened and occasionally looked at each other across the table with the particular expression of people who are beginning to understand something they cannot yet put entirely into words. After dinner, Lily sat between them on the couch and started a puzzle she had been working on for 2 weeks. She narrated her progress. She asked Victoria to find the blue pieces. Victoria found the blue pieces. At some point, Lily's head began to lean and then settled, very naturally, against Victoria's arm. Victoria looked down at the small weight there and then looked up at Daniel, and he was watching the two of them with an expression that was careful and open and entirely undefended. He did not say he forgave her. He did not deliver a speech. He reached across the puzzle and moved a piece into the correct place and said, quietly, that the edge sections were the hardest part, but you couldn't skip them. She thought about that for a moment. Then she nodded and went back to finding the blue pieces. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. They were, instead, something more durable, a series of ordinary evenings that accumulated into a shape. Lily continued asking questions that contained more insight than any boardroom discussion Victoria had sat through. Daniel continued being a man who showed up entirely to wherever he was. Victoria continued learning more slowly than she would have liked, with more false starts than she would have admitted to anyone how to be present in a room without also managing it. One morning in late autumn, she arrived at the apartment to find Lily at the kitchen table with a worksheet spread in front of her, and a serious expression that suggested the worksheet was losing. Victoria sat down across from her without being asked. Daniel was in the next room. She could hear him moving, the particular rhythms of someone at ease in their own space. She looked at the worksheet. She asked Lily to read her the problem. Lily did. Victoria worked through it with her, step by step, the way she would have explained a budget discrepancy to an analyst, not because the comparison was apt, but because she had only one way of working through things carefully. And it had been with her a long time, and it turned out it was useful here too. When Lily got to the answer on her own, she made a sound of pure satisfaction that had nothing complicated in it at all. She wrote the number down. She looked at Victoria and said, very seriously, that she was good at this. Victoria did not know, for a moment, whether Lily meant the math. She said thank you. She meant it in more directions than she could count. Daniel appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Victoria without asking whether she wanted it, and leaned against the doorframe and looked at his daughter and at the woman sitting across from her and smiled, not a wide smile, not the kind that makes a statement, but the small and private kind that people make when something they were hoping for has quietly, without announcement, become real. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. Some things are understood most clearly in the silence around them.